A 1.2 million pound machine, purpose-built to conquer a mountain, parked and abandoned barely 15 years after it was delivered. Not worn out, not broken, just done. Industrial logic suggests that when a company replaces its main machinery, the old equipment must be broken, worn out, or outperformed. None of those conditions applied to the big boy. The 25 units built by the American Locomotive Company did exactly what Union Pacific engineered them to do. They hauled massive 3,600-ton freight trains up the steep mountain grades of Utah and Wyoming without helper engines, running reliably through the demanding years of the Second World War and the decade that followed. They were the pride of the fleet, moving millions of tons of wartime materials, military supplies, and post-war industrial freight across the Continental Divide with unprecedented efficiency. Yet, by July of 1959, the final revenue runs were over. By the end of 1961, Union Pacific corporate management had removed the entire class from its active roster, sending most of these operational giants directly to the scrap yards. Accountants and executives in Union Pacific's Omaha headquarters made the decision to retire them, rather than the grease-stained mechanics in the roundhouses. If these machines were still mechanically sound, highly capable, and possessed unmatched pulling power, why did the railroad's leadership decide to abandon them? No successor locomotive beat the big boy in a direct test of raw strength. The end of the steam era did not result from a simple duel between old and new engines. A shifting economic system sidelined them. The search for answers leads past the locomotives themselves, away from the tracks of the Wasatch grade, and directly into the changing economics of the entire American rail network. The physical bottleneck sat in northern Utah and western Wyoming. Here, the Wasatch grade climbs 2,500 feet over 65 miles, starting from the yards at Ogden, at an elevation of 4,200 feet, and rising to a summit of nearly 6,800 feet at Wasatch. For Union Pacific, this 1.14% sustained incline was the most punishing segment on its entire transcontinental main line. Every ton of eastbound freight had to fight its way up this mountain. In the late 1930s, moving heavy freight over this summit required a massive, coordinated effort. The railroad relied on a mix of large locomotives, including two 880 Mallets, heavy Santa Fe types, and early Challenger engines. But none of these machines could handle a standard freight train alone. As a result, Union Pacific had to run a highly complex helper system. When a heavy train arrived at the base of the grade in Ogden, workers had to couple a helper locomotive to the consist to push or pull it up the mountain. This helper system was incredibly expensive. Every helper engine required its own engineer and fireman, doubling the crew payroll for a single train. Once the train crested the summit at Wasatch, the auxiliary locomotives had to be uncoupled, turned around, and sent back down the mountain. This constant backtracking created severe yard congestion at both ends of the grade. It also wasted thousands of tons of coal and millions of gallons of water just idling engines while crews waited for scheduling slots. Dispatchers faced a continuous logistical puzzle, trying to balance helper locomotive availability with the flow of incoming freight. In 1936, Union Pacific's leadership met to address this operational bottleneck. Executive William Jeffers, Research Chief Otto Jabelman, and General Superintendent J.W. Burnett discussed a radical alternative. Burnett challenged the engineering team to design a single locomotive that could handle the mountain alone. Jabelman's department set out to build a massive engine capable of hauling a 3,600 to 4,200-ton train over the Wasatch grade without any helper assistance. The goal was to replace a costly system of auxiliary engines and double crews with one self-contained machine. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, took Jabelman's specifications and transformed them into steel. Between 1941 and 1944, Alco delivered 25 of these massive machines to Union Pacific. They were designated as the 4884 class, a wheel arrangement never used before or since. This layout was the key to conquering the Wasatch grade. It featured a 4-wheel leading truck for stability, 2 independent sets of 8 driving wheels to grip the rails, and a 4-wheel trailing truck to support a massive firebox with a 150-square-foot grate. The critical innovation was articulation. The locomotive's frame was split into 2 sections connected by a hinge. This allowed a machine measuring 132 feet, 9 inches long, longer than 2 standard passenger cars, to bend around the tight mountain curves of Weber and Echo canyons. Every technical detail was optimized for continuous power. The boiler operated at a pressure of 300 pounds per square inch, containing more than a mile of internal tubes and flues. This boiler fed steam into 4 cylinders measuring 23 3/4 inches in diameter. In working order, the entire locomotive and tender weighed 1.19 million pounds. This immense weight sat heavily on 68-inch driving wheels, preventing wheel slip on the steep climbs and translating steam pressure into 135,000 pounds of starting tractive effort. The 4884 was not a publicity stunt or an exercise in corporate hubris. It was a highly specialized functional tool designed for a single geographical bottleneck. It did exactly what Union Pacific designed it to do. It hauled 3,600-ton trains up the 1.14% grade at a steady 18 miles per hour, completely unassisted. A single crew in a single cab now did the work that had previously required multiple locomotives, double crews, and a complex helper dispatching system. December 1941 thrust the United States into World War II, and the American railroad network suddenly faced the greatest logistical challenge in its history. Millions of tons of steel, fuel, weapons, and troops had to move across the continent to supply 2 ocean fronts. On Union Pacific's vital overland route, the newly delivered big boys became the backbone of this massive effort. Between 1941 and 1945, these locomotives ran almost continuously. The railroad worked them to their absolute limits, and they delivered. A single 4884 routinely hauled military equipment, heavy machinery, and raw ore up the Wasatch grade, maintaining an availability rate over 80% during the peak war years. This reliability far surpassed the older, mismatched fleets of helper engines they replaced. At the Cheyenne and Ogden yards, the big boys were treated as indispensable industrial assets. They represented the absolute peak of reciprocating steam technology, a mature, refined system that had been perfected over a century of American railroading. Every part of the locomotive, from its massive boiler to its articulated frame, operated at the limit of what mechanical engineering could achieve. To the crews operating them and the executives directing them from Omaha, these giants seemed completely secure. They were the undisputed kings of the rails, proving daily that nothing else could move wartime tonnage across the Continental Divide with such brute efficiency. During these years of intense production, the idea of replacing them would have seemed absurd. Steam was more than dominant. It was the very fabric of American heavy industry. But this peak of performance also represented a ceiling. The steam engine had been engineered to its absolute physical limits. Even as these massive locomotives kept the wartime supply lines moving day and night, the seeds of a systemic shift were already planted, waiting for the high-pressure demands of the war to subside. In the late 1940s, a new competitor appeared on the Union Pacific Main Line. It did not look like a worthy successor. It was flat-nosed, painted in bright yellow, and hummed with a low rhythmic growl instead of the thundering roar of high-pressure steam. This was the diesel-electric locomotive, specifically the early Electromotive Division F units. On paper, these new arrivals looked completely outclassed. A single F7 diesel unit produced only 1,500 horsepower, a fraction of the big boy's 6,200. To traditionalists, replacing a giant with these underpowered boxes seemed like corporate madness. Yet these smaller machines carried a quiet, systemic advantage. The diesel did not need to match the big boy's individual strength because it operated under a different set of rules. Union Pacific was shifting its entire focus away from single-unit spectacles of brute force toward modular, continuous efficiency. The victory of the diesel would not be decided by a dramatic showdown of pulling power on the grade, but by the relentless cold calculations of daily operating costs. For a railroad, a locomotive only makes money when its wheels are turning. Raw horsepower and tractive effort are useless if the machine is sitting idle in a maintenance bay. This simple truth redefined how Union Pacific measured locomotive value. The real currency of the railroad was not peak pulling power on a mountain grade, but availability. The percentage of time an engine was actually ready to work. To keep a big boy running, Union Pacific had to maintain a continuous, labor-intensive servicing cycle. After every single run, each engine required hours of manual care. Workers had to dump ash from the massive grate, clean the firebox, and lubricate dozens of exposed moving parts. Because raising steam in the massive boiler took hours, the engine could not simply be shut down between trips. It had to be kept hot, burning coal and consuming water even while standing still. Maintenance records from the early 1950s show that a big boy spent 4 to 6 hours out of service every day for routine preparation, reducing its active duty cycle to roughly 70%. But the daily routine was only a minor delay compared to the bi-weekly boiler wash. As water boiled inside the engine, dissolved minerals formed a thick layer of scale along the internal tubes and sheets, threatening to overheat and damage the steel. To prevent this, the locomotive had to be cooled completely, drained, washed out, and carefully inspected. This cycle was so demanding that a big boy spent roughly 2 weeks of every month sidelined for boiler wash inspections. For half of its service life, this million-pound machine did not move a single ton of freight. It sat cold in the maintenance bays of Cheyenne or Ogden, earning nothing while consuming labor. The physics of steam only worsened the equation. A reciprocating steam engine is inherently inefficient, converting only about 11% of its fuel's energy into useful tractive effort. A diesel-electric power plant, by contrast, achieved roughly 20% thermal efficiency and could be started in minutes without a lengthy warm-up process. The diesel-electric also operated on a completely different maintenance cycle. It had no boiler to scale, no firebox to clean, and no ashes to dump. A diesel consist could be turned around in under an hour for refueling and minor inspections, achieving an uptime of 78 to 80% during the late 1940s and 1950s, a figure that climbed past 90% as the technology matured. Union Pacific was paying for active utility, and the diesel was simply on the line while the big boy sat cold in the roundhouse. A steam locomotive is only as viable as the physical network built to keep it alive. To run a single big boy, Union Pacific had to maintain thousands of miles of static, high-maintenance infrastructure. Along the Wasatch corridor, from the yards at Ogden, through Echo and Wasatch, and on to Green River and Cheyenne, the railroad maintained an unbroken chain of support facilities. Because a steam engine boils water to create movement, it requires a constant supply. Along the route, massive water towers had to be spaced every 15 to 20 miles. Alongside these stood towering coaling stations, ash dumping pits, and sand houses. The sheer size of the big boy meant this infrastructure had to be scaled up at astronomical cost. Traditional turntables and roundhouses could not accommodate a machine measuring 133 feet. Union Pacific had to install massive, custom-built turntables and expand maintenance bays just to fit the articulated frames. This was a colossal sunk capital investment, completely locked into the physical geography of the line. The diesel-electric locomotive shattered the economic logic of this network. A diesel consist did not boil water. It required no water towers. It did not burn coal. It needed no coaling chutes or ash pits. A diesel engine could run hundreds of miles between simple refuelings at basic oil depots. Almost overnight, the enormous capital investment in steam infrastructure became dead weight. The dismantling began in 1955 when Union Pacific decommissioned the first water tower in Echo Canyon. In 1958, the massive coal chute at Ogden closed, replaced by diesel fuel tanks. By 1962, the historic Cheyenne Roundhouse was downsized, and its oversized turntables were ripped out. The final blow came in 1965, when workers removed the last water tower at Wasatch. The big boy was not just a locomotive, it was the tip of a massive, expensive industrial spear. When diesel arrived, it did not just replace the engine at the front of the train, it allowed Union Pacific to walk away from an entire network of specialized infrastructure, instantly cutting millions of dollars in capital maintenance from the corporate ledgers. While physical infrastructure represented a massive capital cost, the largest daily expense on Union Pacific's ledger was the human workforce. A single big boy on the line required a 3-man operating crew in the cab, an engineer, a fireman to manage the massive coal fire, and a head-end brakeman. But the true human cost of steam was invisible from the tracks. Behind every moving engine stood an army of support personnel. When a big boy rolled into a terminal, it immediately required hostlers to move it, ash pit laborers to clear the grates, boilermakers for inspections, and specialized roundhouse mechanics to lubricate its grease points. This massive support network meant that steam operations were inherently labor-intensive at every stage of the run. Diesel-electric locomotives fundamentally changed this staffing equation. Because diesel units could be connected using multiple unit control, a single engineer and a conductor could operate 3 or 4 coupled locomotives from a single cab. The controls of the lead unit electronically throttled the engines behind it. The railroad no longer needed separate crews for every block of horsepower. This modular design also eliminated the massive ground support workforce. Diesels did not have fires to clean, grates to shake, or complex valve gear that required manual lubrication between runs. A diesel consist could pull into a yard, swap crews, and depart within minutes, requiring nothing more than a fuel hose and a single inspector. By the early 1950s, Union Pacific's internal labor cost studies confirmed the stark financial reality. Running a steam-powered train cost roughly 30% more in crew hours than operating an equivalent diesel-powered train. With collective bargaining agreements, under the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, locking in rigid work rule constraints for steam operation, management saw only one viable path to protect its bottom line. To cut operating expenses, they had to eliminate the jobs that steam forced them to maintain. Replacing the big boy was not a decision about mechanical capability. It was a highly calculated effort to monetize the reduction of human labor. Railroads are businesses. They measure success by a single, unyielding metric: the cost to move 1 ton of freight over 1 mile. The big boy's 6,200 horsepower was an engineering triumph. But horsepower is an expense, not a revenue metric. To understand why the big boy was retired, look at the final accounting ledger, where all the variables of operation, fuel, labor, maintenance, and capital infrastructure converged. In 1954, Union Pacific conducted a detailed cost analysis of its mainline operations. The ledger revealed a stark disparity. Moving 1,000 gross tons of freight over a single mile cost $145.14 using steam locomotives. Operating that same train with diesel-electric power cost $84.03. This represented a 42% reduction in operating costs. That gap of $61.11 per thousand gross ton miles, multiplied across millions of miles of transcontinental travel, represented the boundary between profit and loss for the entire railroad. This margin was the natural result of combining every systemic advantage of the diesel: To calculate the true cost of a locomotive, accountants had to look far beyond the price of coal or fuel oil. They had to factor in the amortization of the physical plant. Every water tower, coaling station, and oversized turntable had to be maintained, and those costs were charged directly against the steam fleet. They had to calculate the workforce burden, including the crew in the cab, as well as the support armies in the roundhouses. Ultimately, they had to adjust for availability. If a locomotive was out of service half the time for boiler washes and fireside cleanings, the railroad had to purchase and maintain additional units to cover the scheduling deficit. The math was simple. A single big boy could pull a massive train, but its low availability meant Union Pacific needed more locomotives in total to keep the line moving. A fleet of diesels, despite having less individual power, could run almost continuously. Because they could be linked together, a single crew could command whatever horsepower a specific train required. If a train was light, the railroad ran 2 units. If it was heavy, they coupled 4. The railroad paid only for the exact amount of power it needed, exactly when it needed it. Against this modular system, the big boy was economically defenseless. It was a custom-built, high-maintenance machine designed to solve a geographical bottleneck. But a railroad does not run on a single mountain grade. It runs on a balance sheet. In the eyes of Union Pacific's executives in Omaha, the mechanical brilliance of the big boy was irrelevant. The engine was an expensive outlier in an industry that demanded standardization. Keeping the fleet alive meant preserving a parallel, high-cost infrastructure and labor pool just for 25 specialized locomotives. The decision was a cold, logical calculation, entirely separate from the big boy's physical performance. The giant steam engines were retired because they could no longer compete on the only metric that mattered. They were defeated by a cheaper decimal on a spreadsheet. On July 21, 1959, locomotive number 4019 completed its run from Laramie to Cheyenne, Wyoming, bringing a quiet end to regular steam-powered freight service on the Union Pacific Main Line. The locomotives were moved to storage tracks, kept in operational condition for 2 years as an emergency reserve, but their boilers were never fired for revenue freight again. By December 1961, corporate management finalized the decision, officially striking the entire 4884 class from the active roster. The physical destruction of the fleet followed with remarkable speed. Of the 25 engines built by the American Locomotive Company, 17 were sold to metal recycling firms. Most of the dismantling took place at the Union Pacific scrapyards in Cheyenne, where cutting torches quickly reduced millions of pounds of specialized steel to piles of raw material. 8 of the engines survived the scrap drive, saved only because Union Pacific chose to donate them to public parks and museums. Locomotive 4012 was sent to Pennsylvania. 4017 went to the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And 4014 was towed to Pomona, California, to sit on static display at the Rail Giants Museum. This transition was swift and quiet. The locomotives that had conquered the Wasatch grade and carried the heavy burden of wartime freight were treated as simple real estate to be cleared from the books. No grand public ceremonies marked their departure. Clerks lined out the numbers on inventory sheets, hostlers parked the final units, and the era of the giant reciprocating steam engine on American railroads was over. The true discomfort of this story lies in a quiet, unsettling reality. These locomotives did not fail. They did not suffer some catastrophic structural design flaw, nor did their boilers give out under the strain of the mountain. When the fires were extinguished for the last time, the machinery was as powerful and capable as the day it rolled out of the shops. There is a cold friction in seeing a peak achievement cast aside while still entirely fit for duty. It violates a basic human instinct for fairness, the belief that useful, hard-working things deserve to keep working. The big boy did not slowly rust into uselessness. It was simply turned off. It sat in the yards, fully capable of pulling thousands of tons up the steep mountain grades, while the tracks around it fell silent. This is why the end of the giant steam engine continues to trouble those who look back at them. We are left with the image of a perfectly functioning colossus, silenced by a shift in the surrounding system, rather than any physical wear or weakness. It was retired while capable, a monument to an era that vanished around it. In 2013, Union Pacific workers arrived at the Rail Giants Museum in Pomona, California, to reclaim locomotive number 4014. For 52 years, the engine had sat on static display, a silent monument in the West Coast sun. Towed back to the Cheyenne Steam Shop, the machine underwent a painstaking multi-year restoration to active service. During disassembly, mechanics discovered that the boiler shell showed minimal corrosion, protected by decades of dry California air. The massive driving rods required only minor machining to meet original tolerances, and the articulated frames needed little more than new bolts. To prepare the engine for modern operations, crews converted the firebox from coal to burn number 5 fuel oil. In May 2019, to mark the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, number 4014 moved under its own power once again. As the only operating big boy in the world, its return to steam showed that the class's underlying capability had never evaporated. The machine was still fully capable of moving thousands of tons. Its survival turned a story of industrial abandonment into proof that the engineering itself never failed. Today, the surviving big boy stands as more than a monument to steam. It is a stark reminder that being the ultimate version of an old technology offers no protection when the surrounding system changes. The ledger always favors the network over the machine, a truth that still shapes our modern world. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments.